Hey everyone, I just wanted to make this video. I won't be referencing any articles or news sources or documents or anything of any particular material. But what I just wanted to bring to the forefront in this particular video is the fact that if you look at on the political landscape or the media landscape and observe exactly who it is that are putting forth and presenting this overarching narrative that has everything to do with identity politics, which is, putting people into subcategories or subgroups, right? And using that as a means to pit one group against the other. And if you go back to, not just postmodernism, but the cultural Marxism, that's a tactic that's been used many times over for political opportunists, right? For ideologues. But what we have to point out today, in today's atmosphere, in today's environment, are the ones that are doing it are those that would be predominantly, your typical leftists, your progressives, right? I don't even like to call them liberals because in reality, if you understand the true definitions of the word liberal, these people really don't represent liberalism in its original concept, in original form, right? So predominantly you would say collectivists. Definitely collectivists, definitely. I mean, think about it, collectivists. They like to pit people into groups and put them up against each other, right? So these are definitely collectives. And all these collective ideologies, they had nothing to do with what modern Western, especially the US, but even England and Canada and Australia to a certain degree, those countries, the Western values predominantly promoted and espoused by those historical figures, right? Whether it's the founding fathers, but it wasn't necessarily that form of collectivism. It was a respect of the individual. So it was more or less individualism, right? Collective ideologies, they came from it was definitely old world Europe or like Middle Eastern or tribal cultures in Africa or First Nation cultures, that where you sacrifice the individual for the greater good, for the collective, right? Those concepts are something that have put forth and presented by many different factions and many different variances on the collective ideology, but they all have that same very basis. The very foundation of their ideology is the sacrifice of the individual for the greater good, right? Even old world democracies were basically about that, but they were trying to elevate and educate people to say that, well, basically it was the aristocratic, the middle class types, right? They were trying to fight against what they deemed as their oppressors, right? So whether it was dictators or monarchs, right, from the past, especially in Europe, predominantly monarchs, the middle class, the aristocrats, like, I'm tired of being ruled over by these people that claim that they have authority over me, right? So that's where democracy comes to fruition, and that democracy spread out into a larger subcategory than just the aristocrats and what would have been considered then the middle class. They tried to stretch that out, but once you create that platform, once again, where it's majority or mob rule, well, as we've seen time and time again, that always turns to be just another basis, another method, another platform for authoritarians to rise to the top. The U.S. experience, the American experience, even the founding fathers, the even overarching umbrella narrative and ideology or philosophy that created the United States of America from the former 13 colonies was nobody has any authority over each other. It's all about respecting the individual. And once you break it down to, if you care about minorities, of course, the individual is the smallest minority on the planet. So you have to, once you break it down to the minority, there is no longer this concept. There's no longer this belief of sacrificing the individual for the greater good, because that individual may very well be some of the best people in that collective group. So no, you never want to sacrifice the individual. And even if you go back to especially the New Testament and Jesus, right? Now, he chose voluntarily to sacrifice himself, but there was never any concept where it was forced that he had to. The Christian narrative, especially, like I say, from the New Testament, was all about the respecting the individual and free will. That's the other key factor, is free will. You know, Jesus or God could have very easily, with the power, right, especially God, could have forced the people, the serfs, the subjects, to have to adhere to what God says. That could have been something, because as we understand, God supposedly had all this omnipotent power, right? But that was not the path that was chosen through those biblical teachings. It was, you give the people the option. You give people the free will, and they will have to suffer the consequences for their actions, for their immorality. But that would come usually, some in the here and now, based on, the kind of people that you deal with in your family or your community. But most of that suffering would have predominantly been done after life ended, going to hell, right? So there was always the carrot and stick approach, but it was about respect and free will, the individual, and the punishment was something that was imposed on you subsequent to your current existence, because the people that taught these things recognized that if you use other people to punish you, then that's usually not going to work out well, because there's no such thing as a perfect human being. That was another thing that was pointed out poignantly throughout many aspects of the Bible, right? Nobody's perfect. We're all fallible human beings. But these leftists, these collectivists predominantly, and if you look at who these people are, these are predominantly atheists. People have rejected any sense or form of the old world religions, especially Christianity, of what the morality that's entailed with. They figured that they can come up with their own concepts. And that, like I said, and this has been hammered through many, many times, and especially with cultural Marxism and postmodernism. And basically they've given up on the very concept of any genuine morality, and they've said, listen, it's all subjective and up in the air. And that's where, as you're seeing, look at this, century or two into this, and we're seeing, look at it's failing humanity, it's failing Western cultures, it's failing Western societies tremendously, because we can't place faith in each other. We have to place our faith, if we're going to have any faith, any sensible understanding of what morality entails and what it's supposed to mean, is we have to place that faith in an ideal. And that ideal historically has been God. Now, we can change that in the future. We can change that now if we want, right? But until that happens, we all have to respect and understand the fact that it should promote, if there's going to be an authority, an ideal authority, that authority has to be something or someone that is completely removed and obscured from being a human being, right? Because the minute we put any of that power in a human being or an individual or a group, then, well, it just, because humans are recognizably fallible, then that's always going to be the very first step, the very first base that will take you to and lead you to authoritarianism, totalitarianism, where certain people, certain groups get to impose their edicts, their preferences, their opinions on others. The ideal is abstract. God is an abstract proposition, but because that is abstract, right, and it's outside our normal realm, the world that we live in on the planet, on Earth, it's an ideal that we should respect and adhere to. I guess that's the dominant narrative, like I say, from the historians, and especially from the Enlightenment era, is the reason why they didn't want to reject religion completely. They wanted to separate the religions from governance, right? But what they never took into account, I suppose, at that time, was that this form of governance would become a new religion, right? That the people that adhered to, believing in human authority, that they would turn that into a cult or a religion that would challenge what the ideal being, right? And even Ayn Rand, right? The ideal person that Ayn Rand put forth in her objective philosophy was all about creating the ideal man, which you will never be able to point to and say, oh, this person is that. It was, once again, a fictional concept, a fictional construct that was basically in line with the outer world godliness, but instilled that kind of belief, instilled that kind of ideology into ourselves, right? So it was still about promoting and respecting the individual, but an ideal was the base concept, right? And that base concept of an ideal human or an ideal God is always about an individual thing. It's not, there's not multiple gods, right? It's one. And so it has to be about the individual. That's how you judge your own actions and behaviors, is against another individual. You can't judge against a group, because a group is, like I said, that's a concept, that's a construct that once you break it down, it's just individuals. It's just individuals. So everything, all proper philosophies, all proper politics or principles has to be all about the individual or an ideal, right? So whether it's land-based or a mystical being up in the sky, it always has to be about the individual. And the people, like I say, these leftists, the ones that keep putting forth, presented this dialogue, this narrative that's all about hatred, bigotry, racism, sexism, those are the ones that they seem to be overwhelmed and completely embodied with this belief that you have to pit people against each other based on their race, their sex, their religion, right? Their heritage, their culture. These are the people that come predominantly from academia. These would be considered, if you ask them, they would even self-identify as leftists, as collectivists, of people that promoted democracy, mob rule, majority rule, right? Or this pretense that they have some kind of authority over others. So if you look at things properly, in the proper perspective, I think what's truly happening is that these leftists, these ideologues, are projecting their own insecurities, their own fears, their own recognition of their own fallibilities onto the rest of us. And in some way, you know, it's kind of good that we can see that, right, from afar. If you're looking at it objectively, you recognize that, okay, that's what their problem is. These are the people, these are probably the ones that are truly bigoted. These are the ones that are truly racist. These are the ones that are truly, you know, sexist, right? These feminists, especially, like, they keep pointing to everyone else that they oppose, but if they just held up the mirror, they'd recognize instinctively and immediately that, shit, all the things I'm talking about, all the things I'm espousing, I'm really talking about my own personal subjective experiences, my own personal failures, not just morality, morally, but philosophically, and in terms of principles, and in terms of how I see and deal with the other people in my community or in my country. These people are the ones, like I say, they're projecting their own failures onto others. So this is something that we all should be pointing out, especially now when we're talking about, because identity politics, I mean, it's so rampant now. That's just the go-to narrative for anyone that's considered a collectivist or a progressive or a leftist or those from academia. They're trying to use this identity politics as a mean to an end for their own ideology, for their own ideological leanings. But we have to point to them as, listen, hold up, folks, hold up. Listen to the way you're talking. You're the ones that seem to be trying to paint all black people or all white people or all women or all men with one broad brush, right? You're the ones, and because you believe in collectivism, and you will admit, most of them will admit, yes, they believe in collectivism. So don't you recognize instinctively, or are you so ideologically driven that you can seem to be able to negate and neglect the fact that you're the one that's all about collectivism? You know, the people that you're opposing, especially people like me that are libertarians, I'm all about the individual. So I don't look at people as a collective. Now, I can use generalized statements, and lots of people use generalized statements that can be true to a certain degree, right? But I always recognize that, you know, even though I recognize there are certain patterns in human behavior depending on your sex, your race, and all these other things, I always respect and promote the individual, because there's always exceptions to the rule. There's always exceptions to the norm. So once you've turned to using generalized statements as a basis to oppose, especially with government, right? To use that force, to use that gun in the room against everyone else, That's that race to the bottom. That's the devil showing his ugly head. The horns are coming out at that point, at that stage. So we really got to push back against these collective ideologues, right? Forget about, whether you're conservative or liberal. You're never going to change everyone. There's never going to be a time when humans are alive that I can see, or that I can foresee, where everyone's going to believe and agree with everybody on everything at all times. I don't believe that is probably ever going to happen. So the best thing you do is just, like I say, just like with everything you deal with, every endeavor you've ever dealt with in any situation in your life, is there has to be some ground rules that everyone has to obey and adhere to. As long as we all understand the base ground rules, then you can do your thing, you can do your thing. But we all have to recognize that theft is wrong, right? So taxation, forced welfare distribution, socialism, communism. We have to recognize that, rape, murder, violence, like beatings, anything that people don't go into voluntarily with their eyes wide open and understand things properly, then we know there's always going to be a means or a measure or a method where people will use their particular ideology or their political preferences to impose on others. Respect the individual and all the historical precedent that has brought us to this point where we can actually, where I can even sit here and talk about this stuff without, an immediate fear that somebody's going to smash my fucking door in, right? And blow a hole through the side of my head for just speaking out, right? And this is something that's happened many times historically. So all these things that have been brought to the forefront and it's taken generation after generation to create and to instill into the mind of especially people in Western cultures and Western countries, is we have to get back to the basics once again, right? We have to all adhere to the same rules. We don't have to force our opinions or our edicts or our preferences on each other. We just have to respect each other as individuals and say, listen, you do your thing, but we all have to follow the same rules. You don't get to use theft. You don't get to steal from me. You don't get to be an authority over me. You don't get to rape me. You don't get to cause injury to me. You don't get to, use violence against me in any way, right? Base rules. We have to get back, and and I hate even using the term back because it seems like we're going backwards. In reality, no, we have to go forward and advance that very concept, but so that it's so perfected and so well understood and so entrenched in the ideology, in the education process even, and I don't necessarily mean by a school, by a central planning education system, whether that education comes from your teachers, from your community, from religious leaders, or from education systems. We all have to at least start, like I say, working from the same formulation. 2 + 2 is 4, right? We all have to at least start to understand that, yes, these are the base rules. If there's going to be any freedom, any semblance of individual liberty, if it's ever going to exist, we have to all adhere to the same rules. That's when there can't be any exceptions, right? Everybody has to adhere to the same rules. The minute anyone has an exception to adhering to the same rules is the minute that they will probably use that exception. They will now use that exception to give the pretense of authority. Once you've given someone an exception or a pretense of authority, well, that's the very first step to, once again, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, where liberty and freedoms start to cease to exist. Skinny Libertarian, I love liberty.